All right. Good morning, everybody. This is Panama Bartholomew with the Building Decarbonization Coalition. And thank you for joining our Building Decarbonization Coalition Presents webinar series. Today's topic is going to be Getting Off Gas with Amber Mahone from EThree Consulting out of San Francisco. We're really excited to bring Amber back. We brought Amber back less than a year after her last presentation because, one, Amber is just a great presenter and we love having her present. Two, EThree is a fantastic firm doing critical work in the area of building decarbonization. And three, they have a new draft report on the street that dives into the issues of the future of gas distribution in California in a climate constrained future. So we're really excited to have Amber back. Over 120 organizations signed up for today's call to join in, and so thank you all for joining. You are on mute because we're going to have so many people calling into this. What I'd like to do, if you have questions, if you could ask them via the chat feature, and then we will ask them of Amber at the very end of her presentation. She's going to present for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. I'll read off the chat, and this meeting is being recorded, so don't type or say anything that you don't want to be saved in perpetuity and then passed on. So just a little bit of background in the Building Decarbonization Coalition. We are a nonprofit organization. We're a coalition of energy providers, manufacturers, the design and construction community, local governments, and non-governmental organizations. And we all are working together to come up with both political and market-based solutions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the built environment. We're up over about 150 members now, and it's a fantastic group to take part in. We just finished a 2-day summit on electrical panels and neighborhood distribution grid and implications of electrifications on those. Next month, we're going to have a workshop with some of the leading voices on finance coming together to talk about accessible finance. And then we put on webinar series like these. So if you are not part of our coalition and you want to take part in forums and collaborate on solutions with some of the leaders working in this space, please do feel free to join, and I'll give you the link at the end of the presentation. Earlier this year, the coalition adopted a roadmap, which was our recommendations for where we think California should be going to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment. This was a consensus document agreed to by, at the time, 90 of our members. We've grown another 60 or so members since January. And it laid out some numerical goals that we thought California should meet. Including the state should adopt a zero emissions building code for residential buildings by 2025 and commercial buildings by 2028. And that through retrofits, through policies, programs, incentives, financing, et cetera, we would bring about a complete elimination of greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment by 2045 or sooner. Implicit in that is the sales numbers for heat pump technology, air source heat pumps and heat pump water heaters to dramatically scale sales so that by 2030, 100% of all heating equipment sold in California would be of the heat pump variety. I will just say that as of this week, we now have 17 local governments that have adopted a REACH code that either discourages or completely disallows natural gas hookups in new construction. Pacifica and Santa Rosa on Tuesday became the 16th and 17th cities to adopt policies like that. And then we're going to see a wave more. By the end of the first quarter of next year, we're expecting that about 40% of Californians will live in a jurisdiction that's adopted a building decarbonization policy. Behind those numerical goals, the coalition also identified 5 goals that are going to be necessary if we're going to meet these targets. The first one is really building awareness across all participants within the energy space in California, from providers to businesses to end users. We need to make sure that through rates and rebates and financing, that customers are receiving a good value for the building decarbonization measures that they install. And we need to make sure that the builders and installers are actually making more money installing electric appliances that rely on clean electricity rather than fossil fuel appliances. We need to work with supply chains to make sure that we've reduced barriers to the implementation of electrification technologies, as well as making sure that they're scaled up to be able to meet the rate of sales that we're expecting in California. And then lastly, we need to align all of our policies in California at the state and local level so that we can encourage the other 4 goals. This webinar series is really part of goal 1. We put on a monthly webinar with some of the top thinkers, doers, designers, and troublemakers within building decarbonization. We bring them together, and about once a month, sometimes twice a month, we have them on this webinar series. And so thank you very much for joining. And we're going to hear from Amber now, but if you would like to join the coalition, it's very easy to join. Just go to buildingdecarb.org/join. We have a founders level. This is the first year we're opening our membership, our paid membership program. And if you come in before the end of the year, you'll pay a special reduced founders rate that'll be lower than what you'll pay on January 1st and moving forward next year. So that's the Building Decarbonization Coalition. Once again, you're all on mute. If you have any questions during the call, please use your chat feature and we'll ask Amber at the end. This is being recorded. And with that, Amber, I'm gonna throw it over to you to walk us through the future of gas in California.
Great, thank you very much, Panama. Let me just share my screen here to get us going. Can you guys see those slides and hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. So I want to apologize. I'm a little bit under the weather today, so if I sound stuffed up, that's the reason, but I will try to make this as crisp and clear as possible. This is a study that we have been working on for over a year, and the draft report has just been posted. So I'm excited to share it with you all. This is sort of the first time I've been able to talk about the report being available. The work was funded by the California Energy Commission through a peer research grant. We did a public workshop this summer and received a bunch of comments from the public and stakeholders, all of which we considered. The draft report was released in October, so just recently, and we're just wrapping up a 3-week public comment period on the report. And so we're expecting that the final version of this will be available in early December once we are able to read and incorporate all of those comments. So just a little bit about the study team. EThree, my company, led the work. We used our California economy-wide pathways model, which has been used by various state agencies and long-term greenhouse gas scenario planning. And we also developed a gas revenue requirement model that we use to evaluate the impacts of those scenarios on gas customers. We worked with UC Irvine's Advanced Power and Energy program as part of this research, and they led the work evaluating renewable natural gas technologies, and they also did the air quality impacts analysis that I'll touch on briefly. The process for developing this report involved input from a technical advisory committee that represented a pretty broad range of stakeholders, from Southern California Gas Company to Sacramento Municipal Utility District, Pacific Gas and Electric, Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Funds, and others as well. But I do want to be clear that this work is the research team's sort of independent study. It's not endorsed by the Energy Commission, and it's not endorsed by the Technical Advisory Committee. So I guess I'll also just point out there's a link there if you want to find the report and the appendices. Those are posted on the CEC's website. So with that introduction, I'll move into what were we trying to do with this project? What were our research questions? So we started out by looking at the technology options to decarbonize the natural gas system. So the questions were looking at what are the options, what are the costs, how much is available, and what are the different strategies, basically, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within the context of achieving California's economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction goals. Then we wanted to take the results of that and feed it into an analysis looking at the implications for natural gas customers specifically, and what would be changes to natural gas customer rates and gas customer bills for those different strategies. And we looked at both gas customer bills as well as electric customer bills in order to do sort of a comparison of a customer cost perspective. And then finally, as I mentioned, UC Irvine led the work around outdoor air quality and the impacts on public health. And through their work, they were able to look at what would be the air quality benefits and human health benefits of basically electrifying buildings and other decarbonization strategies. And for the first time, really isolate the air quality impacts of just electrification of buildings. So the scenarios that we evaluated, we looked at quite a range, but we ended up in our report focusing on two key scenarios, a high building electrification scenario and a no building electrification scenario. And all of these scenarios achieve an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, but just using different strategies. And I'll say that this research agenda was defined and mostly, the key pieces of it were in place before Governor Brown's 2018 executive order, which calls for carbon neutrality by 2045 and might imply that we actually need to get more than an 80% reduction by 2050 if we want to meet a carbon neutrality goal by 2045. But for the sake of this research, it's an 80% reduction by 2050, which is still quite aggressive. And these two scenarios achieve, as I said, the same level of total emissions in 2050 with different strategies. And so what you'll see in these blue bars, the no building electrification scenario leaves more greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector and squeezes emissions further in industry and transportation. The converse is true. In the high building electrification scenario, we're able to bring emissions in buildings down much lower, and it leaves more emissions remaining in the transportation and industrial sector. So that's just sort of a high-level overview of kind of the differences in these scenarios. As I mentioned, we used the California Pathways model to model these and work them up. And that work is really building on a report that we published in 2018, also with the California Energy Commission EPIC research grant. And that study is called Deep Decarbonization in a High Renewables Future, if you're interested in kind of learning more background about our modeling approach and framework. So across all of these scenarios, there are 4 key strategies to decarbonize energy. And these 4 strategies, energy efficiency and conservation, electrification, low carbon electricity, and low carbon fuels, are common across all of the scenarios that we've ever evaluated and all of the regions that we've looked at. Even outside of California, we've done deep decarbonization scenario work in Minnesota and the Pacific Northwest, across the U.S. as a whole, other places in the U.S., and these 4 themes are consistent. What varies is the relative emphasis on each of them and the sort of different strategies that can be employed within one of the given pillars. So I'll talk about how we use each of these in our work going forward. This work is kind of really focused in on strategies to reduce natural gas emissions from buildings. And I'll talk a little bit more about the reason for why that is. We were looking at the natural gas distribution system in California. And it turns out that the majority of that system is built and designed to provide gas to buildings. We have transmission level pipelines that serve gas primarily to industry and electric generation. But the bulk of the cost of the system is really in the distribution system, and that's all aimed at getting gas to buildings. So how do we reduce gas from buildings? And as I said, we looked at these two sort of bookend scenarios, a no building electrification scenario where we're blending renewable natural gas in the pipeline, and a high building electrification scenario where we're really emphasizing a transition towards electrification and electric heat pumps. There may be a third option, which is sort of a hybrid option where you could have electric heat pumps with gas backup for reliability and meeting peak heat needs. We didn't evaluate that in this work, but it might make sense, particularly in colder climates, where we've been doing some work in Minnesota, for example, the Pacific Northwest. Some of these hybrid options might make more sense than they do in California's relatively mild climate. Okay, so what is renewable natural gas? Just to kind of lay the foundation, we're talking about 4 different strategies in general. You've got, kind of going from the left to the right, you've got waste biogas, and that can come from things like municipal waste, landfill gas, wastewater treatment facilities, dairy, manure, methane capture. And those tend to be the lowest cost and most commercialized of these options, but they're also limited in supply because of the availability of those waste resources. You've got gasification of biomass is another option, and that involves taking either waste and residue, agricultural and forest products, gasifying it and turning it into biomethane. Or you could even assume that there's purpose-grown crops, such as developing switchgrass or miscanthus and turning that into biofuels. In these scenarios, we don't assume that there are any purpose-grown crops due to both the lack of commercialization of that pathway as well as the land use, land change, sustainability concerns around the development of purpose-grown crops. So for this work, we're assuming that waste and residues are available as a biomass product to make biomethane. And then you've got hydrogen. There's different ways to make hydrogen, but the way to make it that is low carbon and that we evaluated in this work is basically using renewable electricity with electrolysis to split water and produce hydrogen. We assume that we can blend that hydrogen into the natural gas distribution pipeline, but only up to 7% by energy, which is equivalent to about 20% by volume, in order to avoid triggering sort of really costly infrastructure upgrades to harden the gas distribution pipeline, which would be necessary if you wanted to get to higher blends of hydrogen in the pipeline. So once we sort of use up that 7% hydrogen in the pipeline, you move to the most expensive and least commercialized of these options, which is synthetic natural gas. And to produce that, you take the renewable hydrogen that I just talked about, and you combine it with a climate neutral source of CO2, which could be a waste byproduct from biofuel production. The process of making ethanol, for example, produces a pure stream of CO2, which is derived from biomass products, so could be combined with that hydrogen to make synthetic methane. Or you could do direct air capture to get that climate neutral source of carbon to combine with hydrogen. So both hydrogen and synthetic natural gas face challenges in terms of commercialization and cost, but are both potentially very valuable sources of decarbonized energy carriers, particularly as we move towards an 80 by 50 or carbon neutral future. We looked at 2 different scenarios for hydrogen costs. And when I say we here, I really mean our partners at UC Irvine took a deep dive into the literature and came up with 2 kind of bookend ranges for a conservative case and an optimistic case for hydrogen and SNG. And I won't get into the details of those cases, but needless to say, there's sort of more technology learning in the optimistic assumption, sort of assuming more of a global market for hydrogen and SNG develops in order to bring that cost curve down. So I'll move into the key findings now. That was sort of a quick overview of some of the study context and background. So one of the first findings of this research is that there's really not enough low-cost renewable natural gas to fully decarbonize California's gas pipeline without levels of electrification. And since this is the Building Decarbonization Coalition, you've probably seen a version of this chart, maybe from Panama in the past, or maybe you've seen this chart itself from our draft results that came out in June. But I'll just walk through it quickly anyways. What you see on the x-axis is the supply of renewable natural gas. And out here on the far right, at about 2.2 quads, the blue dotted line represents how much gas is used in California today. And moving to the left, the black dotted line represents how much gas might be used in California in 2050 with no electrification, but just meeting our SB 100 goals, for example, which will require zero carbon electricity on the grid, displacing natural gas generation, as well as higher levels of energy efficiency to meet our climate goals. But even if we were able to bring our gas demand down to this level, in the range of 1.2 quads, we still just don't have enough supply of this green resource, which is the low-cost biomethane. The purple here represents hydrogen. You can see there's two tranches of that. This is the conservative and the optimistic tranche. And then the orange and the red here represent two different ways of producing synthetic natural gas. You can see those are also quite a bit more expensive. So that was sort of one of the first, I guess, important findings of this work, is just that, even assuming that all of the waste biomass residues that we think California might have access to, even if all of those were put towards biomethane production and not used for other biofuels, say in transportation or industry, we still just don't have that much of this resource. What you'll see in these scenarios is that we think that this renewable natural gas, particularly the lower cost portion of the supply curve, is a very valuable way to meet our climate goals, but we probably want to use it in sectors of the economy that are difficult to electrify. The other key finding is that the scenario, the high building electrification scenario, with lots of building electrification, is significantly lower cost from a total societal perspective than the no building electrification scenarios. And that's even under the optimistic hydrogen and SNG costs. And what you see in this figure is a cost relative to a reference scenario, essentially. The next finding is moving on to the air quality results. And what we see, and I don't think that this is too surprising, it's pretty intuitive, but it was the first time that I think this had really been quantified in this way, is that building electrification improves outdoor air quality. And what was surprising to me, in fact, was the impact that building electrification had on improving winter particulate matter. And the reason for that is that there is secondary PM 2.5 that is created from the NOx emissions that come from gas appliances. And when you electrify those appliances in buildings, you avoid the NOx emissions, and thus the secondary PM 2.5 is not created. And so what the map shows is the reductions in wintertime PM 2.5 in a scenario where we're just isolating the impacts of building electrification relative, with no other changes in the scenario. So UC Irvine did this work. They modeled episodic air quality impact. So it's basically a 2-week period in the winter that they're modeling, and they also modeled a 2-week period in the summer. So we don't have annual health savings, but we do know from just that 2-week winter period that the health benefits range from $166 to $249 million. So pretty significant air quality benefits. Excuse me, I'm going to get some water to try to soothe this cough. Okay, so moving on to the next key finding. We looked at implications for gas customers and the gas distribution system of these low carbon scenarios. And the first thing to know about the California's gas system is, where are the costs and how are those costs divided? What this figure represents is an estimation of California's gas system revenue requirement. So basically the revenue that the gas utilities in the state collect on, from their gas customers, basically to cover the cost of operating and maintaining the gas system. And what you can see from this figure is that the biggest portion of that revenue requirement is in the residential distribution cost. And the reason for that is because the distribution pipeline system is massive, and it serves 80% or more of California's customers. This figure on the right is an example from PG&E. It shows the miles of gas pipeline, and you can see that the miles of distribution pipeline, 42,000 just in PG&E's service territory alone, swamp the miles of transmission pipeline that PG&E owns and operates. So this kind of also helps illustrate why this study focuses on the gas distribution system, but basically the low pressure pipes that are serving gas to buildings across California. Utilities have an opportunity to earn a rate of return on their invested capital. So, this revenue requirement in the figure above is that invested capital that they can earn a return on. The gas commodity itself is a pass-through for the gas companies. So, the total gas revenue requirement in California is about $7 billion. There's an additional $7 billion per year, plus or minus, depending on the gas price, that California spends just on the natural gas commodity itself. So I think that's just some important background information to understand about how California's regulated gas utilities are sort of structured and where the costs lie. The next figure, I apologize, this is a little bit busy, but I'm trying to pack a lot of information in here. What you see on the left here in the columns is the natural gas demand, or the gas throughput, by sector. So the green is the electric generation, EG, and you can see that in all scenarios, the reference scenario on the top, the high building electrification scenario in the middle, and the no building electrification scenario on the bottom, the electric generation gas demand is decreasing precipitously, even in the reference scenario. And that's due to the state's renewable portfolio standard goals and SB 100 renewable development, basically displacing and driving out gas generation in the state. The red represents industrial gas demand, and you can see that basically remains pretty constant in the reference scenario and decreases slightly in the two decarbonization scenarios. But where the biggest change is in the blue wedge there, which represents gas demand in buildings. You can see that it remains relatively flat in the reference scenario, and that's due to energy efficiency kind of offsetting population growth. But in the high building electrification scenario, it drops precipitously. In the no building electrification scenario, the gas throughput in buildings remains relatively constant, but the composition of that gas looks very different. So the middle column here represents the composition. The light blue is natural gas, the green is biomethane, the orange is synthetic natural gas, and the purple is that 7% hydrogen that we blend into the pipeline. And what that means is that the gas commodity cost increases in these two decarbonization scenarios. So, in the high building electrification scenario, we're using as much of the low cost biomethane as we can produce. That increases the gas commodity cost through 2030, and then we've sort of maxed out on that potential and the cost stabilized. In the no building electrification scenario, you have this range from the conservative to the optimistic, but the cost of the gas commodity itself becomes very expensive because we're blending in those more expensive renewable natural gas options into the pipeline. So, big picture, we're seeing a decline in gas throughput in all the scenarios, even in the reference scenario, and we're seeing an increase in gas commodity costs in all of the scenarios that meet our low carbon, climate goals. So gas rates are an important part of this story. And one way to think about how you get to a gas rate is you take the revenue requirement, which is shown on the left here, you divide it by the throughput, which is the gas demand, and that gives you an average rate, an average cost per therm. And what we see is in the no building electrification and the high building electrification scenario, the average gas rates increase pretty substantially. This is without any type of gas transition scenario. But this, rapid increase in gas rates, I think, creates concern from, an equity perspective, from an energy affordability perspective. This is sort of a wake-up call that, this sort of future might not be the best path forward, and we want to start thinking about other solutions. On the electricity side, you have sort of a similar framework. On the left, you have the electric revenue requirement, and you can see that the electric revenue requirement is going up a lot faster than the gas revenue requirement. And the reason for this is because we are decarbonizing the grid and also serving a lot more electric loads through electrification. So you can see that the load growth there is really picking up. We show sort of both a base case in the solid lines there and a dotted line representing a wildfire cost sensitivity. The wildfire costs are still very uncertain and kind of a moving target, but we wanted to represent kind of an upper bound to see, how bad could it get for electricity costs if, those costs are kind of all burdened into rates. But, even with those higher revenue requirements, the fact that electricity demand is growing, in part due to transportation electrification, even in the no building electrification scenario, there's quite a bit of load growth from transportation electrification. The average rate ends up being kind of muted. And so we don't see those sort of runaway increases in electricity rates in the 2030 to 2050 timeframe. And that kind of juxtaposition is important in that we see these sort of gas rates, the potential for those to really increase faster than electricity, driving some of the consumer economic results. So putting those, this is on a percentage basis. If we want to put the gas rates onto kind of more of an apples to apples basis, we've here converted electricity into an equivalent dollar per therm. And so the blue dots here represent gas rates, a dollar per therm, with a range there representing the conservative and optimistic assumptions in 2050. And then the yellow dots representing electricity rates, and that represents our wildfire sensitivity and our no wildfire sensitivity. And so you can see that today, electricity rates are quite a bit higher than gas rates. That's the figure on the left there. And then as we move towards a more decarbonized gas system, 50% decarbonized gas in the middle, 100% decarbonized gas on the right, you can see that the cost of gas is increasing and becoming, more in line with the cost of electricity. The other piece of this story that's important, though, is fuel efficiency. So it's not just what's your rate, but how efficient are you using that energy? And I think people on this call probably appreciate this, but I don't think it's widely understood how much more efficient an air source heat pump is relative to even a very efficient condensing gas furnace. And that's expected to remain true all the way through 2050. So you combine these two pieces of information, the fuel cost and the efficiency, and you can come up with an estimate of monthly bills. And what you see on the left here is that today, a gas furnace and a gas air source heat pump result in about a comparable home heating bill for a typical Californian. But as you start to decarbonize the gas system, and you have higher cost of decarbonized gas, basically, you end up seeing that it becomes much more expensive to heat your home with decarbonized gas relative to heating your home with decarbonized electricity. So that sort of pretty basic math results, I think, in a need for some serious thinking about, how do we plan for the future of our gas distribution system. We basically see the potential for many factors contributing to a challenge for the California gas utilities' sort of current business model and challenges for gas customers that may, either not be able to electrify or kind of continue to use gas for whatever reason. We've got aging gas infrastructure, the potential for rising gas commodity costs, including RNG and hydrogen that we talked about, to lead to higher gas rates. You've also, on the other side, you've got lower cost renewables, higher electric demand due to transportation electrification. You've got really efficient heat pumps. You've got the building codes that Panama mentioned at the outset, leading to, economic building electrification. And then we have our climate policies and climate imperatives, driving even just energy efficiency and renewable generation, leading to declines in gas rates. All of that could lead to basically the fixed cost of the gas system being allocated to fewer customers and leading to higher gas rates. So what do we do about this? What might a solution look like? We know that there are long lifetimes to this gas infrastructure. A gas distribution pipeline might have a book life of 50 to 65 years in our current regulatory framework. And if we build that today in 2020, we'll be amortizing that in our bills through 2070. That's going to be a challenge if we're in that sort of world of declining gas throughput and spreading those costs over a fewer number of customers. We also know that maintaining public safety of the gas system is incredibly important, as we've seen from San Bruno gas explosions, the Aliso Canyon gas leak. It's in Californians' interest to ensure that we continue to invest in the safety of this system. And we, I think, collectively have a goal of creating an equitable and sustainable future for all Californians. And that means, not letting any one customer class get, really hit with high energy bills. So I think all of this sort of points to the need for gas system planning and what's kind of come to be called a gas transition strategy. And we need to think about this within the context of meeting the state's climate goals. So our paper considers a few different gas transition strategies. We're not making policy recommendations about, one specific approach to solve this challenge, but really just sort of highlighting that we need to start thinking about this as a state due to the long timelines involved. But what we look at in the study is basically strategies that seek to do two things, which is first, reduce the cost of the gas system while ensuring that there's the ability to continue to reinvest in the safety and reliability of that system, even as we kind of shrink the system and reduce the cost of it. And then think about different strategies to equitably allocate the fixed cost of the gas system that has been, built up over the last, 100 years in California. One option for reducing the cost of the gas system is targeted electrification. And this figure kind of represents two worldviews. On the left, you have an untargeted electrification world where each home in a community is sort of individually electrifying maybe one appliance at a time in kind of a scattershot manner. When you do that, you're basically still maintaining the gas and electric systems throughout that community. On the right-hand side is an illustration of a targeted electrification scheme where an individual community fully electrifies, enabling potentially reduced investment and reduced cost in maintaining the gas pipeline to serve that community. So I think it's worth a little bit more research and thought about how this type of targeted electrification might work, how much might it cost. I think it's probably worth considering many aspects of this from the engineering side to the cost and policy side. There's challenges, of course, with targeted electrification as well, because it may involve early retirement of the equipment if the communities in that home all have different vintages of water heaters and space heaters, and early retirement can also be quite costly. So, a simple solution here is, targeting all electric new construction to avoid the expansion of the gas distribution pipeline in the first place. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I think we'll still have a few minutes for questions. This is, again, a draft study. It's not finalized, but the key conclusions thus far can really be boiled down to 3 points. Building electrification lowers the total societal cost of meeting our climate goals using technology that is available today. And that's not to say that we don't also need significant quantities of renewable natural gas to meet our climate goals. In our scenarios, we absolutely do need it, and it ends up that it's directed mostly towards decarbonizing the industrial sector and the off-road transportation sector. But in buildings, due to those efficiencies of the heat pumps that I discussed above, it ends up looking like the lower cost option to electrify buildings. In all of the scenarios that we evaluate, we see gas demand decreasing. And when gas demand falls and the cost of maintaining and operating the gas system does not, you end up with average costs for the remaining gas customers increasing. And I think that raises serious questions about how to equitably allocate those costs. And so this study is basically pointing to the need for a gas transition strategy, both to reduce the cost of the gas system and to protect low-income and vulnerable customers from the potential for higher energy costs. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't plow through that too quickly, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Amber. And as usual, thank you for being on time to leave opportunities for questions. We got about 15 minutes for questions. Once again, you're all on mute. Please do use the chat feature. We had about a peak of about 76 folks getting on the line. So please use the chat feature. If you need clarification on your question, we'll unmute you. First of all, a question from Joshua Radiff. Does the hydrogen discussion assume that cost comparable hydrogen combustion equipment exists, or does that require special furnaces and water heaters?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in these scenarios, when in the no building electrification scenario, we're blending up to 7% hydrogen into the gas distribution pipeline. There's about 50% fossil, a little bit more than 50% fossil natural gas remaining in the pipeline, along with some synthetic natural gas, which is basically chemically identical to methane. So at that 7% blend, our understanding is that you don't need to upgrade or change out your gas furnace or your burner tip and your stove, but that at that level, the existing equipment can kind of handle a 7% blend. If we didn't evaluate it in this scenario, but there's been some research and discussion, particularly in Europe, looking at, should we consider higher blends of hydrogen in the pipeline, even up to 100% hydrogen. It would be possible to create equipment that could burn 100% hydrogen, but that would require swapping out the burner tip and the combustion equipment to make it compatible with higher blends of hydrogen. And that would come at an incremental cost, as well as the cost of upgrading the gas distribution pipelines to be able to handle those higher blends. Since hydrogen is such a small molecule, it's also highly corrosive. It requires different types of valves, for example, than we currently have to prevent corrosion and ensure that it doesn't leak. So for all those reasons, that's why we limited the hydrogen blend into the pipeline to 7% in these scenarios.
Great, thank you, Amber. From Tim McCrae of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, I realize this work does not include a comprehensive analysis of using natural gas for resilience purposes through technologies like distributed fuel cells. Is there a plan for doing that analysis? And if so, my group, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, would love to help brainstorm the questions to frame that analysis. Maybe some future work there for you guys, Amber.
Yeah, I absolutely think it's a really interesting question. There's the possibility of using distributed fuel cells for resiliency, for example. I think we're moving into an era where we really need to think carefully about how do we combine our climate goals with our resiliency goals and our adaptation, because unfortunately climate change has gotten to the point where we have to adapt to it, wildfires and the like, even as we try to reduce emissions, and we really need to be able to do both simultaneously. So I think it has to be a low carbon solution, whatever it is. That's why I think potentially distributed fuel cells are an interesting thing to evaluate. Yeah. Certainly, there's probably other options as well. Yeah.
I'll hook you and Tim up for a conversation. From David Stevens, to what level was the retrofit requirements? To what level were retrofit requirements integrated into the study? Cost, schedule, etc.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So this study is kind of taking a much higher level, 30,000-foot view on the energy economy, particularly compared to the prior study that I presented on to the building decarbonization a few months ago, that was sort of specifically digging into the cost of residential electrification retrofits. But in general, the philosophy of these scenarios is that we're trying to avoid early retirement of equipment. So that's kind of one piece. We're doing a replace on burnout. And then we just have a really kind of high level adder to try to capture kind of an average cost of electrification retrofits. But it's, you know, it's a single kind of statewide average number. We recognize that it's going to vary quite a bit, and it will be higher for some customers and lower for other customers, and that you know, there's a whole lot more work to be done on kind of figuring out how to deploy those retrofits and what they would cost. You know, particularly as I was highlighting in a future where you're maybe trying to do a targeted electrification effort. Maybe, you know, you're kind of combining vehicle electrification upgrades with building electrification upgrades with deep home energy efficiency retrofits. You know, I think we want to start thinking more creatively about how to do multiple things at once, so that it's not, you know, so that each of these interventions isn't a really kind of costly one-off opportunity.
Great. We have about 12 more questions, so it's going to be lightning round now.
Oh, okay. I'll speed it up.
From Peter McPhee, did modeling of the greenhouse gas emissions of natural gas or RNG include emissions due to infrastructure leakage? In some places, this can comprise a large portion of overall emissions from gas and be equally impactful with RNG as fossil gas.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So we do, within our modeling framework, account for methane leakage. In the mitigation scenarios, we assume that we're able to reduce that methane leakage, you know, 40% by 2030, in line with the state's short-lived climate pollutant strategy. I think, you know, even that's a pretty ambitious, optimistic goal. What we didn't do in this analysis was try to tie the methane leakage kind of endogenously to the assumptions about the gas consumption. I think there's still some questions to what degree the methane leakage is tied to the total throughput versus just the existence of the pipelines. So all that is to say that, you know, we took kind of a high level look at it, but I think there's a lot of room to evaluate that question in more depth.
Okay. From Amy Kaiser, when looking at renewable natural gas, what was the geographic scope of where that would be sourced? California only, the US, other?
Yeah, so also a great question. We looked at biomass potential from across the US as a whole and assumed that California could import up to its population weighted share of that US supply. So we basically assume that we have access to more biomass than could be domestically produced within California, but it's not an unlimited supply, because we do assume that other states and regions would also want access to that biomass to produce biofuels. Great.
Charles Cormany, how are we going to deal with the PM 2.5 generated from wildfires started by electric distribution? The pro-gas folks will use this to scare people away from electrification. Any thought on a response to this?
Yeah, well, I mean, we need to deal with wildfires in any future. I don't think that it's accurate to say that wildfire risk increases due to building electrification, because we're going to be using electricity in any future, and the wildfires are triggered not by, you know, how many megawatt hours you're producing, but just by how many miles of electrolyzed charged transmission lines and distribution lines there are. We actually don't see that there's higher total electricity demand in the high building electrification scenario compared to the no building electrification scenario. And the reason for that is that you still need electricity to produce the hydrogen fuels or the synthetic natural gas. So, you know, it's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed, but I don't think it's actually very closely tied to whether or not we electrify buildings.
Okay. From Christina Garcia, she has two questions. The gas demand decrease in all of the greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. The gas demand decreases in all of the greenhouse gas mitigation strategies because of the assumed increase in electric vehicles. So with or without building electrification, we can assume gas prices to increase?
No, I don't think that's quite right. So I'll just pull this chart up. The gas demand decreases in the electric generation sector due to renewable generation displacing electric power plants. The gas cost increases there's sort of an increase in the commodity cost because RNG is expensive. And then in a high building electrification scenario, you have this additional factor, which is lower gas throughput in residential customers leads to fixed costs being spread over fewer customers. So there's sort of two factors driving higher gas costs. One is the high cost RNG, and the other is the lower demand for gas.
Okay, and that lower demand, and where is that lower demand coming from?
Yeah, so the lower demand, it varies by scenario, and maybe we're getting confused when I say gas, I mean natural gas, not gasoline. So the question about transportation was throwing me off, because this isn't really a story about transportation. The lower gas demand is coming from renewable generation displacing gas generation on the electric gen side, and that's just sort of one piece of the story. The bigger piece of the story is whether or not you have building electrification. If you have building electrification, that's reducing the demand for natural gas in buildings. If you don't have building electrification, it doesn't reduce the demand for gas in buildings.
Great.
Does that clarify?
It does. Amber, do you have time to spend a little bit longer after the hour on some of these questions for those that wanted to stick around to have their questions answered?
Yeah, I have a few more minutes, no problem.
Great. Also from Christina, the winter episode air quality improvements are significant. Is this because this is peak winter when there would be the most gas combustion, and then that is compared to the same heat load supplied by more efficient air source heat pumps?
Yes, exactly. So oops, I stopped sharing my screen. That was not what I wanted to do. I was going to move to the.
Well, Amber's pulling it up. For those of you that do want to stick around to have your questions answered, to hear those questions, we'll go another 10 minutes after the hour. For those of you that have meetings or need to move on at the top of the hour, thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so the air quality, this is a winter sort of episode that is identified as having the highest air quality challenges. And so in the building electrification scenario, we are now using air source heat pumps and heat pump water heaters to heat our homes and heat our water. And that is avoiding a significant amount of NOx emissions. And those NOx emissions then are avoiding a significant amount of wintertime PM 2.5. And that's what's really driving the health benefits. Now, I want to say there's also health benefits and air quality benefits from electrifying transportation or industry. And those, in fact, may be larger than what you see from electrifying buildings. But it's not insignificant. And this was the first study that I'm aware of where we were able to just isolate what's the role of gas use in buildings in driving outdoor air quality problems, and how much could we avoid those outdoor air quality problems through electrification of buildings.
Great. From George Beeler, your study and this presentation are very well done! Exclamation point. Decarb is necessary, but I'm concerned about the unintended consequence of replacing gas furnaces with heat pumps in climate zones 2 and 3 in well-designed buildings, new or existing, that currently do not need air conditioning. large summer peak loads will be added?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a trend towards higher saturation of air conditioning across the state. And so I think it's quite possible that even if you didn't have a home that transitioned to an air source heat pump, they might still get an air conditioner because it's getting hotter. And we are seeing those trends. So I sympathize with that concern, but I think that it's, you know, better to have efficient end use in the home that creates a comfortable home for residents than, you know, trying to stave off the inevitable transition towards higher air conditioning saturation in the state. You know, that said, there are other solutions. You know, we worked in our previous study with Point Energy Innovations, and they talked about, you know, in new construction, if you really don't need air conditioning, you can do a very well insulated building shell and just use electric resistance strip heat for heating and avoid the cooling altogether. And that can be a very low cost solution to electrify. So I think that we need to be smart about sort of solutions that are tailored to the local climate and the local building owner's needs, and it shouldn't be a cookie cutter, one size fits all solution. You know, I think there's also a set of concerns in really, you know, in colder climates. California doesn't have a lot of those, but you know, up in the mountains it does get cold, and you might want to think about having you know, cold climate heat pumps installed, or you know, some backup heat options in addition to getting the efficiencies from heat pumps kind of throughout the year.
Yep. And that gets to the next question, which is from Jason Keene, more of a comment. It says, hi, Amber, thanks for addressing the challenge, or at least the optics of the challenge of air source heat pumps in northern colder/winter climes. I've been getting some pushback on this from folks I've talked to about building electrification. And Jason, I would say if you're still on, definitely a great resource and presentation was done by Synapse called Electrify Everything Meets the Polar Vortex, where they analyzed heat pump performance in 3 northern Midwest states during the polar vortex this February. So you just Google Electrify Everything Meets Polar Vortex, you'll find a presentation and a report on that. But any further thoughts on that, Amber?
No, I mean, it is an issue. I think there are technology solutions and smart ways to address it, but what you don't want to do is just ignore the issue. But I think it can be addressed, and heat pumps are getting better all the time.
From Charles Kim, have you considered a scenario of converting electricity to hydrogen during curtailment? Yeah, so that's actually part of the lower cost tranche of hydrogen that we evaluated. So when you have overgeneration of renewables, it's low cost, it's zero carbon. You could do lots of things with that energy. You could store it in batteries. You could encourage people to shift their loads to soak up that, or you could produce hydrogen with electrolysis. And in this work, we do assume that any renewable overgeneration is used to produce hydrogen. The problem is there's actually not that much of it relative to the gas demands in the state. And we have a figure on that in the report where we just show in the no building electrification scenario, you know, even if you just have 7% hydrogen, the sheer quantity of hydrogen that you would need to produce to meet that demand far, far exceeds the amount of hydrogen that you could produce using renewable overgeneration or renewable curtailment power that would otherwise be curtailed. So it's a good low cost option, but again, it's a limited supply and not enough to really meet the gas demands in the state. Gotcha. I think this is a quick one. Did your load growth for electrification include additional load due to electric vehicle conversion?
Yes.
Okay. Scott Blunk from SMUD, replace on burnout sounds good. He's talking about replacing appliances going from gas to electric. On burnout sounds good, but will never work with the level of compliance we now have. And then there's a series of exclamation points about needing to have better permit compliance.
I agree, Scott. I agree. We do need better permit compliance, and we also do need to figure out sort of how we can get building electrification interventions to be more cost effective when you are not waiting for the replace on burnout.
Great.
Yeah.
Just two more. This is from Jack Padden in Sacramento. Full electrification for new construction of municipal utility areas like SMUD is a no-brainer. We are concerned about avoiding gas in the short term in IOU areas such as PG&E because it imposes higher operational costs. Are there some good guidelines for sorting out cost benefits and advising our clients accordingly?
Well, I don't know if we're at the point of having kind of formal guidelines, but this research is sort of pointing in that direction that in general, it may be prudent to start trying to avoid expansion of the gas system across the state, including in investor-owned utility service territories. I don't know if maybe I'm missing a piece of that question, but.
No, I think what Jack's looking for is a tool or some guidance that you could use. Jack's an architect in the Sacramento area and looking for a tool they could use to be able to basically help people make trade-offs and look at potential increase of costs of the different fuel choices moving forward. And
I see.
We can have an offline conversation about that. But I think to Amber's point, what we're looking at is escalating gas prices in California regardless of scenarios, and probably greater if we're actually starting to see local governments really push policy-based electrification.
Yeah.
And then the last one is from Shadra Mutyal. To the point of adding cooling load, if the building is well insulated, and even if it has air conditioning, customers will not use air conditioning, so no load will be added. I do think that this will be a cost concern for customers when deciding to add heat pumps.
Adding building shell insulation, if it's a retrofit home, does have cost implications. If it's new construction, obviously you can build it with a better shell.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. We had 40 people stick around
Wow.
after an hour to hear all this. And I think you all see why we love to host Amber for these. She's a wonderful presenter, presenting really topical, great analysis. So thank you so much, Amber, for joining us again on the Building Decarbonization Presents. And thank you all for joining us on this call as well. We will be posting this webinar on our website, on the Coalition's website, under the members section. So those of you that are members will have access and be able to share it with others. But thank you again, Amber, and I hope you feel better soon.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.